Erev Tov Rabotai, we are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Sheviit. We are up to Perek Daled, Mishnah Tet. The Mishnah is going to now speak about today a third type of produce that becomes mutar in more than one stage. Zetim, in the case of olives, Mishiachnisu Revi'it L'Se'ah, once they can yield a quarter log of oil per se'ah. Potzea ve'ochel basdeh, you can break them and eat them in the field. The Mefarshim explain that as olives grow, their oil content increases, and therefore you can use that could be used as a sign of ripeness. So when olives reach the size at which a quarter log of oil can be squeezed out of the se'ah of them, they're ripe enough to be eaten in the field. Now we know the Mefarshim tell us that a log is a measure of volume equivalent to 6 eggs. A se'ah is 144 eggs. So when you have a quarter log, a quarter of 6 eggs per 144 eggs of oil, you can break them and eat them in the field. The Rab explains why break them. Olives were broken and softened before eating them to reduce their bitterness. That's why it says break them. Hichnisu chatzi log kotesh v'sach basadeh. Later when they can yield half a log of oil per se'ah, you can crush them and apply their oil to one's body in the field. Hichnisu shilosh kotesh basadeh v'chones metoch beto. Later, when they grow to a third of their full size, you can crush them in the field and bring them into your house where you can eat them or apply them to your body. And Vashim explained that Shemitah produce can be used for certain purposes besides eating, which include applying the oil to the skin or the hair. Now, just like in the case of eating produce of Shemitah, applying its oil to one's skin would also not be allowed until the produce had reached a point where it's usually needed for that purpose. So at the first stage of the Mishnah, when we say that the olives can yield a quarter log per se'ah, people eat the olives in the field, but they would not apply the oil to their skin at all. So the Mefarshim explain that the olives at this stage can only be eaten in the field on Shemitah, but it cannot be used to apply to the skin even in the field. At the next stage, when they can yield half a log per se'ah, people do use the oil to apply it to their skin in the field, so you can use it for that purpose on the field on Shemitah. At this third stage, when they grew to a third of their full size, it is normal to bring them into the house and eat them there, or apply the oil to the skin, so a person can use them for either purpose on Shemitah, even in the house. Even though the Tosfot Yom Tov says, even though the Mishnah says kotesh basadeh, that you can crush them in the field and bring them into the house, it doesn't mean that they can only be crushed in the field. The Mishnah is just speaking about the normal practice, which was to crush the olives before you bring them into the house. And olives like these, which have reached a third of their full size, are subject to tithing in the other years of the 7-year cycle. Now, this Mishnah and the preceding 2 Mishnah taught us that figs, grapes, and olives become permitted in more than one stage. Other fruits, however, only have one stage. Regarding all the fruits of the tree, the stage at which they become subject to the tithing, that's the stage which they become permitted to eat on Shemitah. Only figs, grapes, and olives become permitted on Shemitah to some degree before the tithing stage, whereas all other fruits do not become mutar at all before then. And the Rab tells us that figs, grapes, and olives were commonly eaten in the field before ripening, but other fruits were not eaten at all while it was still unripe. Therefore, before they ripen, other fruits cannot be eaten even in the field, and after they ripen, they can be eaten even in the house. Now, the tithing stage for the several types of produce when they are considered ripe, we're going to learn that in Masechet Masechot Bezat Hashem, chapter 1, Mishnah 2-4. That is in Rabotai, Mishnah Tet. Mishnah Yud now, as an introduction, the Torah forbids us from wasting produce of Shemitah. We quoted this pasuk earlier. It says, Vayta Shabbat Haaretz Lechem Lo'ochla, the uncultivated produce of the land shall be for you to eat but not to waste. So for this reason, it is assumed to cut down a tree that has started to bear fruit, because one thereby wastes the fruit by preventing them from turning ripe. The Mishnah now discusses at which point a tree is considered a fruit tree and can no longer be chopped down. The Mefarshim tell us that before the tree bears fruits, you are allowed to cut it down because a person is not destroying any fruit in the process. Even if the tree is being prevented from producing fruit in the future, that's not a concern. It's only after the fruit started to grow that the prohibition applies. Besides, for the Shemitah prohibition, there is another issur against cutting down fruit trees in any year that we're going to discuss soon. So the Mishnah says, From when are we not allowed to cut down a fruit tree on Sheviit? Bet Shammai Amrim, Bet Shammai say, Kol Ha'elan Mishayotzi, we cannot cut down any fruit tree from the time that it brings forth its first leaves in the spring. Like the Rav tells us, Tchilat Ha'alin B'yemei Nisan, the first leaves in the beginning of Nisan. Even at this early stage, according to Bet Shammai, the tree is treated as though it already has fruit, so it cannot be cut down. Bet Hillel Omrim, whereas Bet Hillel say, Hecharuvin Mishiyishalchelu, carob trees cannot be cut down from the time that the carobs hang down because of their weight. Can't shalshelet, like a type of chain. V'agifanim mishigareu, grapevines cannot be cut down from the time that seeds form inside the grapes. V'azetim mishianetzu, olive trees cannot be cut down from the time that they blossom. Ushar kol ha'ilan mishiyotzi, and any other type of fruit tree cannot be cut down from the time that it begins to produce fruit. Right, that's when it blossoms. That's when the blossoms fall off and the fruit can be eaten. Now the Mishnah tells us, "V'chol ha'ilan kevan sheba leonat ha'masod mutar lekatzetzo." But once the fruit of any tree reaches the tithing stage, it is allowed to be cut down. Why? At that point, when the fruits are already ripe and they're no longer needed, and they no longer need the tree, cutting down the tree will not destroy them, and therefore it is allowed. Now, besides the issur of cutting down a fruit tree on Shemitah, there is another prohibition against cutting down a fruit tree at any time of the year. The Torah says in Sefer Dvarim, chapter 20, pasuk 19, and also Gemara Masechet Makot, page 22a, Lo tashchit et etza lindoach alav garzen, ki mimenu tochel v'oto lo tichod. You shall not destroy a tree by waving an axe against it because you eat from it, and you shall not cut it down. The Mefarshim explain that this issur applies only to a tree that produces a significant amount of fruit. If the tree is old and it produces little, so little that it's no longer worth the work that's needed for its care, the person's allowed to chop it down. On Shemitah, however, when you cut down a fruit-bearing tree, that is not allowed on the year of Shemitah at all, regardless of how much produce it produces, because the Shemitah fruits will become ruined. Another difference between the two prohibitions of generally not allowed to cut down a fruit tree and Shemitah is that if the tree is worth more when it's cut down because of its wood than when it's standing, a person can chop it down in the other years, but not during Shemitah. Now the Mishnah concludes, "V'kama yeh bazayit v'lo yikutzenu." How many olives must there be on an olive tree? Meaning, how many olives does the tree produce for one to be prohibited to cut it down? Rova, the Tanakama says, Rova, a quarter of a cob of olives. If the tree cannot produce a quarter of a cob of olives, cutting it down is mutar in the non-Shemitah years. Again, a cob is a measure of volumes equivalent to 24 eggs, so a quarter of a cob is 6 eggs. Other trees whose fruit is not as important as olives have different limits. For example, cutting down a date palm is allowed unless it produces an entire cob of dates. That's what the Rav tells us. The Mishnah continues, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, Hakol lefi hazayit, there's no set amount, it depends on the olive tree, meaning if the tree produces olives of high quality, so it cannot be destroyed even if it produces less than a quarter cob. And if the olives are poor quality, it can be destroyed even if it yields more than that amount. That is how the Chazon Ish explains it, brought down by the elucidated art scroll. That is Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Everybody should have a Erev Shabbat Shalom. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.